science fiction is performing an extraordinarily useful function in the sense that it offers a picture of futures which may be more or less desirable and allows us, on a hypothetical basis at least, to choose between them in advance of the event.
John Brunner's Stand on Zanzibar is regarded by many as one of the classics of recent science fiction. It's a frightening portrayal of a crazed and overpopulated world, a grim reminder of what could happen in the not-too-distant future.
This is the modern successor of the fair which was granted to our village more than 500 years ago. And in those days they had a custom when they opened a fair. They used to raise a glove because, as you know, the way in which you issued...
In contrast to the worlds he imagines, Brunner lives in the small Somerset town of South Petherton and is one of the organisers of their annual folk festival, originally the brainchild of his wife Marjorie.
Let me therefore say, the glove is up. Let the fair begin.
When I was still quite a small boy, I was about 6, I think, somebody misguidedly left a copy of H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds in my nursery. And at that stage, I had just discovered that reading was fun. And I read this book, and I was so delighted with it, I drew Martian fighting machines all over the end papers. And I suppose I was printed, as they say, because after that I simply could not get hold of enough science fiction throughout the rest of my childhood. I decided I was going to be a writer when I was about 9 years old, and it was natural that the first thing I attempted to write was a science fiction story. I honestly only remember one thing about it. It featured a Martian called Gloop, but I could never work out how to put an ending on it, so I'm afraid I abandoned it. Well, I served my time as a writer of hard science fiction. I wrote space opera and the grand manner, interstellar empires, that kind of thing. But I found in the long run that I had neither the educational equipment, the grounding, nor the actual temperament which this calls for. I never had a science lesson in my life, and just being dazzled with the potential of technology isn't enough to sustain a writer's career. Little by little, I found that my temperament, above all, was drawing me towards what I think of as close focus science fiction. That's to say, fiction set in that period of the future that I might reasonably expect to survive into myself. And this, paradoxically, is a great deal more challenging than the stuff I was doing earlier. Because if you go way out into the voids between the galaxies, there's almost literally no restriction on what you can do with your imagination. On the other hand, if you're actually trying to extrapolate contemporary trends, then you have to impose on yourself a very firm discipline. You have to make all your projections abide by the trends and tendencies you can see in the contemporary world. And this, to me, has turned out to be much more rewarding than the wild and woolly fantasies of my early years.
Brunner was invited to lecture at the World Science Fiction Convention held in Brighton. Conventions are an integral part of the SF world, giving writers and fans a chance to meet and discuss the genre. Characteristically, he chose as his subject the future as an obsolete assumption.
Now, the context of this panel at Westercon was very definitely the so-called energy crisis. The audience were individually and collectively smarting under the recent sudden increase in petrol and other power supply prices in a way which we in a far smaller country like Britain would not feel so acutely.
we are a great deal less dependent on the car. I tried to address myself to this problem above all. I tried to speak as the only person on the panel who had actually seen a lifestyle collapse. Those of you here who are my age or older...
I do enjoy going to science fiction conventions, I must admit.
will know exactly what I'm talking
Because by going to conventions, I get a tremendous amount of feedback from my readership. Because in the course of an average convention weekend, I know perfectly well I'm going to meet 20 or 50 people who read something of mine and want urgently to discuss it with me. With the passage of the years, I became more and more cynical, though, about the possibilities of contemporary technology. Back in the 1930s and 40s, the big questions were things like, can we liberate nuclear energy? Can we send a rocket to the moon? And subsequently, of course, after we'd done these things, the central question became, if we're so clever, why aren't we smart? In other words, why, if we can do these marvelous things, can't we live together in a sane society? Because the opposite side of the coin of modern technology is represented by things like the hydrogen bomb, which put our very existence as a species into question.
Don't you hear the H-bomb's thunder echo loud?
John and Marjorie were both active members of CND in the early 60s. They lived at that time in Hampstead, one of the most influential and vociferous branches in the movement.
Makes the earth a tomb. Do you want your homes to tumble? Rising smoke towards the sky.
I've never for a moment regretted the time and energy that I sank into CND, in particular the 4 months that my wife and I spent touring Europe with an exhibition about nuclear weapons. We went to 7 countries with it, and it had a lasting effect on my mind because we were living night and day with images of horror and destruction. But I came to the eventual conclusion that I could reach many more people by writing a story than by walking down the street with a banner.
Shockwave Rider was published in 1975. It derives from the considerations of Alvin Toffler in his book Future Shock on the impact on our everyday lives of the widespread use of computers.
One of the minor drawbacks, of course, of specializing in this kind of close-focus science fiction is that the real world is currently offering us the raw material only for pessimistic speculation. Even the marvels of, let's say, the computer age, which one might have hoped would be a liberating force, seem to be, in a fair way, to giving us brand new reasons for paranoia. When I developed the protagonist, Nick Haflinger, who rides the shockwave of Future Shock, in fact, during the course of the novel, I decided I was going to have to give him some kind of exceptional talent. So I made Nick Haflinger capable of rewriting his own personality through a computer remote terminal.
He's pursued through the databanks, caught and interrogated on evidence supplied by the very computers he used to retain his individuality.
I'm terribly afraid that instead of being a liberating force, the computer may be converted into an instrument for a more efficient tyranny than we've ever seen in history. I wish I could believe otherwise, because ultimately I'm certain we will grow out of what I regard as a rather childish obsession with power over other people. But on the other hand, there is always that terrifying image from 1984 where O'Brien explains the pattern of the future. A boot stamping on a human face forever. Naturally, projecting all the complexity of an imaginary future world with any degree of rigor, of logic, becomes much more difficult the further away you move from the present day. So, the simplest and often the most convenient form in which one can tackle a theme of this kind is to examine the impact of a single new development at the time when it's changing the world that we ourselves would recognize. A case in point would be something like The Last Lonely Man, which examine some of the consequences that might flow from the development of a means of surviving death. The notion is a kind of transmigration of souls, if you like. You get tuned to somebody, and either you or he will transfer to the other person, to the opposite number, in the event of an accidental death.
You're lucky we just got the cover in for Avengers of Carrig, the finished version from Dick Healy in London, who usually does that.
Brunner is a regular visitor to the States, combining lecture tours at conventions or universities with business, like meeting his American publisher Donald Wollheim of Door Books.
Jet-propelled aircraft. And I really think I would have liked these volcanoes in eruption a bit more because it was an active volcanic range.
I would have agreed with you, but these things, these covers reduced so much that if you had the great deal of crowded background in, by the time you get this whole thing down to small size, you wouldn't have much to see, and you would just be cluttering up your picture. What you have now is a strong single scene.
Oh, that's okay. Are you going to run it with my name bigger than the title, or the other way around?
We use this same type each time.
Okay.
In other words, every John Brunner book we do has this same style of type on it. So your name would be up here, and the title, The Avengers of Carrig, will be below that.
Yep.
I don't know whether we'll have a secondary blurb line or not. I'll have to think about that. But this is upcoming in about, well, actually it's January scheduled. We'll have to do copy for this in about another month or so.
His more recent books have sold well in America, which is not always the case with British science fiction writers. It's possible that his success over there can be attributed to his mid-Atlantic style, combined with the ability to write about the States with a greater objective detachment than American writers themselves.
Oh, I know. It's terribly confusing, isn't it? How's the business doing?
Onward and upward.
Fantastic.
Very good. How's business with you?
Oh, me? I have odd things coming out all over. In fact, you may very well have something. I knew it. I knew it. You've got it. I haven't seen this yet.
You haven't seen it?
If any author ever tells you that authors can be modest, don't believe him. There's no profession really more egotistical than that. I mean, honestly, do you know, the first time I ever saw something of mine in print, I used to hold it up in front of me like this and just stare at it for 10 minutes together, thinking, I did that, it's all my fault. Me? But, well, I scripted one picture, but this was a long time ago, and it wasn't terribly successful because, well, quite candidly, the producer was an honest man. I've chosen American settings for a great many of my stories, even though I've never lived in the States. I've visited it frequently, but I've never lived over there. I think essentially because one of my recurrent themes is the misapplication of technology, and I've seen it worse in the States than anywhere in Europe. As you might say, visiting the States, I have seen the future, and it doesn't work. When one thinks of the threat that was voiced a few years ago to pave Southern California to make it fit for motor vehicles rather than for human beings, I think possibly you get an inkling of what it is that disturbs me about the insane misapplication of the consequences of our own brilliance. The thing that really scared me when I was working on The Sheep Look Up, which is about chemical and industrial pollution, that kind of thing, was that I didn't have to invent anything. I took all the raw material for disasters I packed into that book straight out of the daily newspapers and out of things like New Scientist. At the time when I wrote Stand on Zanzibar in the middle 1960s, it appeared that the world's population was going to continue exploding. Well, there have been a number of factors which have mitigated this. Nonetheless, this doesn't, I think, invalidate the argument of Stand on Zanzibar, which is that if too many people are in the world can't cope with them.
They'll tell you that the whole human race could be put on the 147 square mile Isle of Wight. True? Maybe in 1918. Today, you'll need the 221 square mile Isle of Man. And by 2010, something bigger still. Something like the 640 square mile Zanzibar. It's the story of the complex future world, of violent incidents and self-involved characters spanning 3 continents and several months in time. The world population is 7 billion. Only the genetically perfect are allowed to breed. And someone discovers how to optimize embryos so that every child can be an Einstein or a Helen of Troy. Brunner's problem is to make this huge canvas convincing.
It took me 2 years of intermittent thinking before I suddenly realized I didn't have to devise a way of doing this. It already existed. I could steal it wholesale from John Dos Passos and see what I could do to compile imaginary counterparts for his newsreels, his actual biographies of real people, and so forth. And I'm pleased to say that it worked a treat.
Go on. Come on, come on.
That's a good girl.
Go on, Aunt. Come on, this way. Good dog. Come on.
When Marjorie and I moved down here from Hampstead in London, we did very much wonder whether we were doing the right thing. Because we'd been there about 17 years. You sink very deep roots.
Come on.
But within a surprisingly short space of time, we discovered that sheer luck had brought us to one of the nicest places we could have chosen.
Good dog.
Hi, Kevin.
Good girl.
Please, okay. Sit down.
The Brunners have always enjoyed folk music. They know a lot of musicians and were both going to skiffle clubs when they met. Starting and organising a folk festival when they arrived here was a natural progression.
To be frank, there were some people who were a bit dubious when the festival was started.
She's too expensive too.
Of course, yes. I think they had in mind something a bit more like a Windsor pop festival. But, well, of course, their fears were unrealised, and now a great many local people, I'm glad to say, turn out and join in the fun. And, of course, this also gives us a reason to bring people down to this part of Somerset who've never ordinarily come within miles of it. And last year, I recall, we had a sort of fan letter from a girl in Scunthorpe who said it made the journey worthwhile, 250 miles one way.
White Cockade are a local group, but the festival also attracts musicians from all over Britain and this year from France as well. So perhaps one of the futures in Brunner's mind will escape disaster.
To find riches in hunting the way. No seed time nor harvest is ever known there, and the birds here sing sweetly on mountain and dale, but there is nay a birdie to sing to the whale. There is no habitation for a man to live there, and the king of that country is the fierce Greenlander. And there'll be no temptation to tarry long there.